In the summer of 1936, the British Union of Fascists announced that they intended to hold a series of meetings in the valleys of South Wales. They even prepared a leaflet written specially for the miners.
The miners' only hope. The international vested interest can only be smashed by a determined, disciplined force of steel true blackshirts, pledged to ruthless extermination of anti-British interests.
But awaiting them was an equally determined force. A local militant, Isabel Brown, said that summer,
"Not even the ears of the sheep on the mountain shall be defiled by the words of Mosley."
The fascists planned to hold a meeting here in Aberdare Park, where the crowds had started to gather hours earlier. Mr. Brynmawr Powell was in the crowd, having ignored his father's orders to keep clear.
But being a boy, like, you know, up for mischief, I went over. And it was chock-a-block of people.
The crowd, it seemed, had armed themselves with saucepans, baking tins, anything they could make a noise with. The fascists came to the park, dressed as usual in black uniforms, and erected a loudspeaker.
Then the rumpus started, the pans and the lids and the saucepans, everything was going in there. And this was going on for quite a spell, because they were still trying to get this microphone on top of the van to speak. Well, this fella got up then and they actually caught hold of him and pulled him down and took the shirt off his back, tore the shirt off his back. And, you know, I thought it was going to get really dangerous.
The police stepped in at this point and the fascists beat a hasty retreat.
But the wrath of the people when somebody tread on their toes, like, and that was very frightening.
Mosley's supporters tried to hold another meeting in Tonopandi. Over 2,000 people turned out, and after heavy stone throwing, there were 36 arrests, none of them of fascists. But the meeting was abandoned, and once again, the fascists were forced to retreat. The fascists didn't try to organise in Welsh-speaking Wales, where a new youth organisation, Urdd Gobaith Cymru, and a new party, Plaid Genedlaethol Cymru, were just getting off the ground.
I think you've got to remember that Plaid Cymru was a very, very small party, Plaid Genedlaethol Cymru, Welsh Nationalist Party, and that's very revealing to call itself a nationalist party. It looked at other nationalist movements in Europe and was not very sophisticated in the way that it embraced some of those nationalist movements. Of course, Plaid Cymru was personified really in the personality, the leadership of Saunders Lewis. And Saunders Lewis from the 20s had been very, very sympathetic to right-wing thinkers and writers and eventually political leaders. He made a number of unfortunate remarks, not only about supporting fascism in Germany, but also some borderline anti-Semitic remarks as well.
Hitler fulfilled his promise at once, a promise that had been severely mocked by the London papers for months previously, to completely eradicate the financial strength of the Jews from the economy of Germany.
And later, in a poem, Saunders Lewis wrote,
"The gods decreed with their feet in the Oberson carpets and their Hebrew snouts in the quarter statistics that the day had come to restrict credit in the universe of gold."
Welsh people feel that they were a part of Europe.
But John Daniel, a lecturer at University College Lampeter and son of a Plaid Cymru pioneer, won't accept the accusation that Saunders Lewis and Plaid were anti-Semitic.
I don't want to reject the claim that Saunders Lewis was, in any serious sense, anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism can mean a lot of things, and if one is talking about anti-Semitism in a politician, one's looking for anti-Semitic policies. It's absolutely plain that during the 1930s, Plaid Cymru had no anti-Semitic policies, and neither did Saunders Lewis attempt to foist anti-Semitic policies upon them.
This is not a defence of Saunders Lewis. Hitler and Mussolini at the time were the nationalist parties par excellence. They were succeeding, and so there was a sense in which they looked to those parties for some kind of a sustenance. What was unfortunate, of course, that there were those very small nations in Europe, like the Czechs and the Slovaks, who suffered appallingly as a consequence. And yet, people like Saunders Lewis tended to side with Greater Germany rather than with the small nations. So there was an enormous paradox there, which was not lost on people who wished to adjudicate on Saunders Lewis.
If we're talking about international fascism, then I would want to say that Plaid Cymru's priority was the situation in Wales, and that the struggle against international fascism was happening in other countries, countries on which Plaid Cymru had absolutely no influence or power. And in that sense, it would have been a waste of time for Plaid Cymru to be occupied there.
Saunders Lewis probably saw very little difference between being an English nationalist and being a Welsh nationalist. There were many features of Mosley's aggression and simplicity of language that attracted people like Saunders Lewis.
I think that's an absurd remark. I mean, when we compare Oswald Mosley and Saunders Lewis, Mosley was a man who gloried in the status of leader. I mean, he wore a special uniform. He was a kind of mini Hitler, tried to make himself out. He was also devoted to violent political methods. Saunders Lewis, on the other hand, was a man who so doubted his own capacity, his own fitness for the job of leading Plaid Cymru, that he tried to resign several times during the 1930s. He did not advocate the kind of physical violence that Mosley advocated.
Whatever second thoughts Saunders Lewis may have had in his later years, it seems obvious to me that in the early 30s he shared some of Mosley's anti-Semitic views. The fight against fascism was now becoming Europe-wide. One of those who had been arrested at Tonypandy, Harry Dobson, was sent to prison for 6 months and, when he came out, went straight off to fight in Spain. There had recently been a fascist revolt led by General Franco against a democratically elected government in Spain, and it started a civil war. Volunteers came from all over Europe to join the international brigades fighting fascism. 174 of them came from Wales. But Saunders Lewis's sympathies were on Franco's side.
Again, I would deny that they were on his side. J. Daniel, my father, wrote an article about the Spanish Civil War a couple of months after its outbreak. His attitude was that it was a purely Spanish episode and was misunderstood if it was thought of as being a struggle between communism and fascism. But he said that it was likely to develop into a struggle between communism and fascism. And in that case, if one asked oneself, which outcome did one prefer, then I think that his attitude was that he would prefer the Franco's victory to a communist victory. It must be remembered that this does not translate into a general approval of fascism or a general approval of Franco.
There was quite a lot of support for the people of Spain here during that time. Although there was division in the country over the support of the Spanish Civil War, it certainly didn't do the fascists any good in this area, as far as I'm concerned. I remember them walking up to King Square in Barry, which was in front of the town hall, and there would be people dressed in black shirts, and some used to be dressed in brown shirts. Of course, brown shirts were supported Mussolini in Italy, and the black shirts were supporting Hitler in Germany. And I used to meet on the square, and lots of people used to crowd round there. Some were hostile, some weren't. But my memory is that the people that were taking part in this demonstration were, well, quite honestly, they were looked upon by a lot of locals as being a bit top-like, being a bit silly, because they really didn't have any message worthwhile to give to the people of Barry. Actually, their message had no foundation whatsoever in what they were saying. I mean, all they could be was anti-Semitic and anti-working class.